Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Horror Analysis. With me, Drew. How are you all doing? I'm doing pretty well. Today we're in part 2 of the 30s. Last time we talked about the movies that went on in the 30s. Let me tilt that down a bit. And this time we're going to talk about the literature. The literature. Last time I also talked about the radio. I'm going to re-mention the radio now because it sort of feels more closely tied to literature. There was more of an interplay between radio and literature than radio and movies, or literature and movies. Movies were separate. Basically, the movies from the 30s were trying to rush to get classic stories on talking pictures. On talkies, motion pictures with sound. That's why you have Dracula and Frankenstein and The Invisible Man, The Mummy. All these classics. Well, Mummy's not a classic story as much. I used to know who wrote the story that was a version of it, but I don't think I do now. No, he'll come to me. It's not something that's going to come up now because it was earlier, I think. But since I don't know, but I'll leave it. Invisible Man was H.G. Wells, which was earlier. All these classic stories are for that reason. Put into film versions because it's the 30s. Talking films just started. For radio, Lights Out was the one that started in 34 and went to 47 and then on TV from 46 to 52. Willis Cooper was the first of the main writers for the Lights Out horror-ish series. Later on, Dimension X became the horror-ish series, suspense to a lesser extent. Which was a suspense series, which bordered on horror and even occasionally had horror stories, but wasn't a horror series. Arch Oboler was the second main writer of Lights Out on radio, from 36 to 47. So we talked about him quite a bit in the 40s. I'm not going to rehash a lot of that, but he definitely focused on stuff that even Noel Carroll would say is pure horror, real horror. Okay, so radio is done. I'm actually just going to toss that note on the ground because I'm done with it now. And that note doesn't have anything to do with anything. Today, for most of the day, we're going to be talking about horror literature during the 30s. And there was quite a bit going on. This is where Robert Bloch is really going to make his start. Of course, we talked about Bloch later on, but right now in the 30s, he was really into the Lovecraftian school, parodying it and emulating it. Pardon. And then, of course, after that, progressing out of that into, writing Psycho and writing other things. We aren't quite ready to jump into supernatural literature and horror. Supernatural horror and literature. SHIL. SHIL is going to be what I'm going to be calling it because that's a great acronym. SHIL. We're not ready to jump into SHIL yet. It was published in 27. Some of the people who are mentioned in here would still be writing into the 30s. Unfortunately, not a whole lot. His first modern masters pretty much ended in the 30s. The ones that didn't die just sort of stopped writing horror. Like Lord Dunsany, Edward Plunkett. In the 30s, he wrote a lot of tall tale type things. His Jorkins series. Arthur Machen's last work would be in the 30s, and they weren't even published in America until the 40s, when Arkham House published them, which is a Lovecraftian publishing house. Arkham is a Lovecraftian construct. So, yeah. Algernon Blackwood is another one of his modern masters. Actually, his modern masters are here. That's one. Arthur Machen died in the 30s, right? Where's my notes? Oh no, he died in the 40s, but his last works were in the 30s. The Green Round and Children of the Pool were in the 30s. So nothing really happened with them after that. Algernon Blackwood's Weird Fiction till 37 stories collection kept coming out until the 50s when he died, and are still coming out today, obviously, but he's not writing anymore. Lord Dunsany, Edward Plunkett, that's his real name. Definitely less fantastic in the 30s and 40s. I think he died in 60. I don't have the notes in front of me, but he was basically writing non-supernatural or only quasi-supernatural tall tales, is how Wikipedia puts it. The Jorkins tales are tall tales, like Baron Munchausen style. And M.R. James, the last one on here, who Lovecraft just refers to as Dr. James. Montague Rhodes, as everybody knows him as M.R. He died in 36, and most of his ghost stories were in the 10s and the 1900s and 1910s. So he was pretty much done with his ghost story writing, his supernatural fiction, by this time, by the 30s. So, for the most part, modern masters are prior to even the 1927. Some of the people that he talks about in chapters before that, the next two chapters are, chapter 9 is this weird tradition in the British Isles, and chapter 8 is the weird tradition in the U.S. So those are what's going on in the weird tradition. Those are people that are going to go on to do other stuff in the 30s and later. Well, mostly not later. All of them are dead before 1900 even rolls around, but a lot of them are dead even before 1900 rolls around. Clark Ashton Smith is mentioned not as a modern master, but as a weird tradition person in America, and he was one of Lovecraft's contemporaries. He was a friend of Lovecraft, actually. Clark Ashton Smith stopped writing in 37 because that's when his parents died. So two traumas of his parents died in the mid-30s, and his buddy Robert E. Howard and his buddy Lovecraft died. Well, Robert E. Howard killed himself, and Lovecraft died in the mid-30s. So 4 big deaths in Clark Ashton Smith's life, and he didn't write anymore after that. He painted, and some of his painting we'll go over in the painting section when I get to non-narrative horror, because it was still kind of horrific. Well, not horrific, but horror-esque. And Robert E. Howard, who most people know as the creator of Conan the Barbarian, Kull the Conqueror, Solomon Kane, which is a quasi-horror series, wasn't mentioned in supernatural horror and literature. But then again, he didn't write a lot of his horror stuff until the 30s. So this was 1927. If he didn't write the horror stuff until the 30s, he's not going to be mentioned in there. I think even Conan the Barbarian stuff is dark enough to be a major influence on filmmaking. Robert E. Howard's writing is very cinematic. You really, I really picture it, and I think a lot of people who read Robert E. Howard really just get, oh, I can see this so perfectly. This would make a great movie. Funny that I don't think the Conan the Barbarian movies were, classics of modern American cinema by any stretch, but the stuff jumps off the page in Robert E. Howard. And we're going to talk about his horror stuff because that was the bulk of his 30s stuff. Well, that's not true. Robert E. Howard died when he was 30, and only started writing in very late teens and 20s. So he didn't have a whole lot of time to write a whole lot. He killed himself when he was 30, so how early can you start, really? An amazing amount of work he put out, too. So, and Lovecraft was good friends with Robert Howard, too. I think he visited him. A lot of this I'm getting, by the way, I'm getting from a documentary that I watched this weekend, which I highly recommend to you guys. It's called Fear of the Unknown. I watched it on YouTube. It's available on YouTube, and it's really worth watching if you're a Lovecraft fan. A lot of the people talking, the main intellectual type, I suppose, would be S.T. Joshi, which was Lovecraft's biographer, also one of Dunsany's biographers. But lost my train of thought there. But a lot of the other people who were talking were authors. Ramsey Campbell. Neil Gaiman was a big contributor to the movie, and Ghost Story, Julia... Peter Straub. Actually, his book's right there. Alright, yeah, Peter Straub. I could have looked over the other direction and found it. Who did Ghost Story that we talked about in our Ghost section, and some other stuff that we talked about in the 70s. Right. It's very good. It's what I said it was called Fear of the Unknown. Good stuff. I definitely recommend it. It was actually a really well done documentary. I don't need this up. Okay. What's going on? And it was very illuminating if you're interested in Lovecraft's life. So Lovecraft didn't mention Robert E. Howard in Shill. The other person, the big name that he didn't mention in supernatural horror and literature for a modern master, was Howard Phillips Lovecraft. He didn't mention himself. I promise you, if he wasn't as influential as he was, I wouldn't be reading this book. This book wouldn't even be republished by Dover Books. The only reason we care about Lovecraft's view of horror during his lifetime was because he's Lovecraft. But Lovecraft doesn't. Was a very humble person. So before 1930s, actually 1929, one of his quotes that was mentioned by Neil Gaiman was he was lamenting his lack of his own style. He said, "I have my Poe pieces, and I have my Dunsany pieces, but where are my Lovecraft pieces?" It's not true that his work prior to 1929 were only Poe-esque or only Dunsany-esque. He just wasn't able to see his own self, his own style in them. Call of Cthulhu, most famous Lovecraft work out there, most well known to non fans, was 1925. I don't have it here, but actually, I probably do have it here. Oh no, that's weird. That's the other part. 26. I had his bibliography up a while ago, but I don't now. Of course. 1920. It was before supernatural horror and literature, so I guess he considered that more Dunsany-esque. It wasn't. It's pure Lovecraft influenced by Dunsany, as maybe Music of Eric Zahn was influenced by Poe, but it's not Poe style, Poe-esque. That's pure Lovecraft. He just can't see himself in it, where everybody else can. Yeah. Lovecraft's work in the 30s. I should have this up. I gotta make another. Lovecraft's 30s work, the most famous one being At the Mountains of Madness, which is still one I've never cared for. Bibliography, Wikipedia. Thank you. Pardon me, folks. Very unprofessional, but I thought I had it up, but I didn't. Okay, so his At the Mountains of Madness was 31. I can get rid of that one. Whisper in the Darkness was 30. Shadow over Innsmouth was another novella, 1931, also very famous. Dreams in the Witch House, The Thing on the Doorstep, The Book, which is a fragment, The Evil Clergyman, which is a letter excerpt, Shadow Out of Time, which is a novella, and Haunter of the Dark, which is his last one. But then he also had some well-known collaborations with other people, like Zelia Bishop. One of my favorites is The Mound, and is by far my favorite mythos story, and by far my favorite Lovecraft story, even more than Call of Cthulhu. And it has a ghost element in there, which freaks me out even more. It's a ghost plus, Cthulhu mythos. And it was a Zelia Bishop collaboration, which I didn't realize until I did the research for today. That was 1930. It wasn't published till 1940. Let's see. Challenge from Beyond. He collaborated with Robert E. Howard and Abraham Merritt. He did lots of collaborations during this time as well. Winged Death. Nothing that's really popping out as, oh my goodness, that one's great, or or that one I know even. But he did have a lot of collaborations during that time, or during most of his career, when he was established. Most of his established career. That's better. So, okay, this is a good transition point. His established career, he collaborated with a lot of people. His established career was when he was writing in Weird Tales. Weird Tales is a pulp, and we're going to be going into pulps a bit today because this is where most of the horror fiction was being produced. Weird Tales and other pulps. Weird Tales being the most well-known. Weird Tales starting in 1923 and went to 1954 before folding, and then it restarted recently, fairly recently. So the current version started in 88. So lots of people were writing in for Weird Tales. Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard. What the heck did I just do? I just broke something. Okay, better. Something jumped out at me. Robert Bloch started in these Weird Tales type things. Lots of people were starting or getting writing in these tales. Pulps were where horror was going because they were cheaply produced, disposable, and of course we're talking in the 30s. We're still talking about the Depression era. People were not buying hardcovers or compilation books really. They didn't have the money to. They were buying Weird Tales for 15 cents for a couple of stories and enjoying them. Who wouldn't? Let's see. What do I have? Oh, so a lot of Lovecraft would be writing from there. Robert Howard, which I haven't talked about yet, was also writing for Weird Tales. He was also writing for sword and sorcery pulps. He was a pulp writer. He wrote. Robert Howard had stuff during the 30s for spicy pulps. I love the term spicy pulps, which is sex stories that you can get away with in the 30s, which wasn't a whole lot of sex, but implied sex. So Robert Howard and Conan the Barbarian, stuff like that, was in sword and sorcery pulps, fantasy pulps. And even sometimes Weird Tales. Some of the not necessarily Conan ones, but Solomon Kane's ended up in Weird Tales. I want to talk about Robert Howard because he's one of my favorites. Actually, Stephen King really, really raved about Pigeons from Hell. Apparently, it was in this book. The reference from it was in Danse Macabre, but I've read this twice. Maybe I just missed it. Maybe I'll just check the notes. Oh, Pigeons from Hell, short story 258. I did miss it. It's right there in the index. 258, my version. Of course. I'm just curious now. Robert E. Howard's Pigeons from Hell. One of the finest horror stories of our century was adapted and remains the favorite of many who remembered Thriller with fondness. Oh, so we're talking about Thriller, the television program, which was from my notes. Where were my notes? Ugh, fell out of my chair there. My notes are not there. '60 to '62. Yeah, so he really raved about Pigeons from Hell. There is available. You can find most of these people I'm talking about from here back. At least some of their stories on LibriVox. Most of their stories you can find on Project Gutenberg. Possibly the Australian version of Project Gutenberg, if anybody's watching from Australia. I guess their laws are a bit different. So, or you can go to an Australian server and do Gutenberg from there if you're going to break rules. I don't recommend breaking rules. But there's some cool Robert E. Howard books. Pigeons from Hell was written in '34, and it wasn't published till after Howard killed himself in '36. It was published in '38. Solomon Kane was a sort of was one of his main series, Robert Howard's main series, about a Puritan type hero who travels around the world to Africa. He has a sidekick and an African shaman there. And one of the tales called Hills of the Dead, which is quite notable. I actually found a copy of Horror Stories of Robert E. Howard, and if you can find that, it'll have Pigeons from Hell in it, Hills of the Dead in it, quite a few other great stories. Hills of the Dead was a vampire story. Essentially, Solomon Kane, the Puritan with a musket and a big staff to beat people with, was fighting vampires. Vampire zombie type things. They were in-betweens. With Nlonga, his shaman buddy, sidekick guy. One of the things that Nlonga did, which is kind of cool, since he's a shaman and a witch doctor type, he summoned a horde of vultures to attack the vampires. Because vultures eat dead things, and vampires are dead things. I thought that was really cool. It was an interesting take on vampires. Since vampires are corpses, and vultures eat corpses, vampires are scared of vultures. It doesn't really fit if you think about, well, vultures only eat corpses because corpses don't move around. Corpses don't go, shoo, don't eat me, bird. I don't know, it's kind of... It falls down after that, if you think about that too much, but it was a cool story, and it was a cool take on vampires. He did a lot of mythos stories as well. He bought into the Lovecraftian mythos in a big way. He wrote a quasi-mythos character called John Kirawan, who discovered, elder god relics and stuff around wherever. He combined horror and western in a Weird West series, and he did other horror and mythos stories as well during the 30s. Great stuff. I recommend Robert E. Howard. You should check him out. And it's worth listening to some of the Conan the Barbarian, Conan the Cimmerian, if you're going to be official. You want to say Conan the Cimmerian, not to piss off the Conan fans, because it's Conan the Barbarian's the movie, Conan the Cimmerian is the name of the series. Such as Kull the Conqueror was the movie, and Kull the Atlantean was the series. But if you get a chance, actually you can find some on LibriVox too. I know you can listen to them, and they're actually a good reader for some of those Conan the Cimmerian stories. They're really good, and they have quite a dark tinge. Robert Howard was definitely a horror fan because his stuff is dark tinged, even if it's not his horror tales. I'm going to talk about Robert Howard some more next time, because in the 20s he wrote one of my favorite werewolf stories. And I'm a big werewolf fan, as I mentioned several times. Right. The other big one, Clark Ashton Smith. As I said, he stopped writing at all when his parents and Lovecraft and Howard died. But some of the stories that he started the Hyperbian cycle in the 20s, and it went on into the 30s. The Zothique cycle, Zothique stories, were in 32. They're very mythos-esque. The Zothique land had worshippers of many different gods. Elder gods were very in there. So very Lovecraftian. Everything's turning back to Lovecraft, as it should. We're talking about the 30s, and we're talking about the 20s. We're going to be either talking about Lovecraft himself or proto-Lovecraft when we're talking about Dunsany. The reason that Dunsany is so influential is because he's proto-Lovecraft, not so much that he's influential on everybody else. He influenced Lovecraft, and Lovecraft influenced everybody today. Lovecraft is a big convergent point. If we're talking about history, is a point of convergence. Everything seems to point down to Lovecraft, and as it should. He's very influential and he's very good. Another, not a quote from Lovecraft, but the quote that was told to me, the Dunsany pieces and Poe pieces, that was said on the video, the Fear. Oh, I said it earlier, but I destroyed that. I X'd out of that window. Pardon me. I exited out of the window. Neil Gaiman said that quote on the video. Neil Gaiman also summed up why Lovecraft is so important. Before Lovecraft, horror stories were based in a benevolent world. The worldview of horror stories in general was a positive one. There was bad things that happened, but in general, God was in his heaven, and all was right with the world. Bad things happened, but the heroes were going to win. God was on their side, stuff like that. That was the mindset behind the horror stories pre-Lovecraft. Lovecraft flipped that upside down entirely. He said, if there are gods out there, I'm not sure about Lovecraft's actual religion. It's not an interest to me. But Lovecraft's fictional religion, if there are gods out there, they're at best don't care about if humans survive. At worst, they're actively trying to destroy humanity. And humanity is doomed at that if they are. The new era is going to begin, and we are screwed. That is the Lovecraft point. If you take that point and you take the point I was trying to make in the 40s and 50s about Shirley Jackson, where she brought things to the suburbs, into the towns where people like us live, like people like everybody live. This is not stuff going on in a haunted mansion, someplace where who lives in a haunted mansion, or who knows where a haunted mansion is even. Lovecraft, or Shirley Jackson, was putting it in with us. Lovecraft was saying, "Hey, we're not dealing with a benevolent worldview anymore. We're dealing with a malevolent worldview, or an ambivalent worldview. You can't expect a happy ending anymore. Tough." And Shirley Jackson said, and this will happen to you. This can happen anywhere, not just in these weird places. Lovecraft still had the weird places, like the creepy village of Innsmouth, and the weird Miskatonic University, and these are general weird things. Weird Tales is the name of the pulp, and they happen in weird places. Shirley Jackson, they didn't happen in weird places anymore. They happened in your kind of places. If you take those two points together, normal places and ambivalent or malevolent worldview, you smash those two together, you have Stephen King rolled up into one. The things are happening in your kind of hometown, and you're not dealing with a nice universe anymore. You're dealing with a bad universe, or a neutral bad universe. That's kind of Stephen King's deal. Super simplified, way oversimplified. I'm not saying in any way that's all Stephen King does. No way, shape, or form am I saying that. Right, that was a tangent. But as Neil Gaiman was saying, we're dealing with an ambivalent worldview now. From now on, from 1930 forward, 1920s forward, no longer are we dealing with a positive worldview where bad, crazy stuff can happen. There are psychos, there are killers, there are, supernatural things that happen, but, eventually the ghost is going to be banished to hell if he causes too much mayhem. Lovecraft tosses that idea out the window. And that's why he's a convergence point. Oh yes. So the other big thing I wanted to talk about. I talked about that one. I did not talk. What did I talk about in here? Oh, Robert E. Howard. I talked about. Clark Ashton Smith. I talked about. Oh, Walter de la Mare. I have his notes here. He's going to be part of this, what Lovecraft in Shill calls the weird tradition. But in the 30s, I don't think he ended in the 30s. Oh yeah, I think he did end in the 30s. Wind Blows Over, 36, contains some of his ghost stories. And then pretty much and then earlier he's going to be popping up some more. But a lot of people are dying in the 30s. Lovecraft himself died. Howard committed suicide. Clark Ashton Smith had so many deaths in his family and friends, he stopped writing, so his work ended. Arthur Machen's last work was in the 30s. Algernon Blackwood pretty much finished up in the 30s. Lord Dunsany kept writing, but he stopped writing fantastic works prior to the 30s. M.R. James died in 36. Most of his ghost stories were way earlier, 1910s and 1900s. Walter de la Mare. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, we're talking about in the weird tradition. She died in 35, but Yellow Wallpaper was her main horror story. That was 1890. Yeah, so a lot of people were dying. Oh, and Kipling died. I didn't write that one down. Kipling died in... Oh, yeah, I did. Kipling died in the 36. Most of his weird stuff was 1900s and 1890s. His weird stories were compiled into a neat little volume with an introduction by the man of the hour, basically, with a neat little introduction by Neil Gaiman. And you can find most of his works, Phantom Rickshaw, Mark of the Beast, that sort of thing, on LibriVox. Most of the stuff that we got back here, when I talk about it, say, hey, you can go on LibriVox and find these things. They're pretty cool. LibriVox.org. That's LibriVox.org. It's a free audiobook site for public domain works. I can't recommend it enough. If you guys are interested in old horror or old books in any way, check them out. Yeah, this was actually a much smoother video than last time. I apologize. 30s movies were just crazy. So many interweaving of actors working together, actors working with directors doing weird stuff as well. It's so much to do, but now we're done with the 30s. Next videos, I think I'm going to split up the rest of 1900 to 1929 into 2 videos. So I can include the movie side of things and the literature side of things together. I'll do the 1900 to 1915 and then 1915 to 1929. Or I'll break that up into an even number. Yeah, so that way I can go over the movies of each period, and essentially after 1900, before 1900, we're not dealing with movies too much anymore, and then we're really into fiction, and we're really into supernatural horror and literature. Okay, folks, uh, we're going to continue with History of Horror, of course. Next time, my name is Drew. Thanks for watching. Have a great night.